Well, first of all, you've got to find a subject, which is normally given to me. It's very rare that I actually think, oh, I want to write about this. I mean, there are lots of times people will say, would you like to write a play about? And I go, no, because it doesn't interest me. So I think the subjects that I'm given are the starting point, obviously. But if you gave the same subject to other playwrights, they would come up with something entirely different. So it is going to be my view of the world once we've established the subject. So Max Stafford Clark, who's a director I've worked with a great deal, and some of the other directors will say, would you like to write a play about? And I go, yes, okay. Or in Max's case, he'll probably say, you will write a play about. So the first play that I wrote for Max, in fact the first verbatim play I wrote, was called A State Affair, which was a companion piece to quite a famous play called Rita Sue and Bob Too by Andrea Dunbar, which was set on an estate in Bradford in Yorkshire. And her play was written in 1982, just at the beginning of Thatcherism, with the closure of the factories, with the mills becoming redundant, with a whole way of life becoming anachronistic, because suddenly the structure on which this great northern town was built was collapsing and there was no heart beating at the centre of the city. So Max's idea was to do, as the first half of the evening, Rita Sue and Bob Too, and for the second half of the evening, a new play called A State Affair, to go back to that estate in Bradford and see what had happened to the sort of people that Andrea Dunbar was writing about 18 years earlier, after the Holocaustic effect of Thatcherism and after the influx of cheap heroin, which at one stage something like 80% of the estate were taking to relieve the boredom and to get away from the dismal reality of what post-industrial Britain was like before it could regain a new identity. You can't have something which has taken 600 years to build up and then vanishes in a decade. You can't expect, like a vast ocean-going tanker, you can't expect it to stop and turn around immediately. So it is going to be this sort of post-wave, crashing wave effect of devastation in this community. So that was the brief, to go and find out what had happened. So the process is like this. In this particular instance, I'm given a team of actors. I'm given 2 local people who know the area very well, a photographer, and then we go off with notepads and pencils and we talk to people. And a lot of it is serendipitous, because in fact, of course, you meet somebody. I said, oh, I'll tell you who would be interesting. My sister's uncle was very interesting, and he was involved in teaching and he had to deal with a lot of these cases, and so you go and meet him, and then he says, actually it'd be very interesting if you meet the local policeman who has to do, and then he says it would be very interesting for you to meet, and so forth. And then so my team of actors and myself go off and we meet as many people in the workshop period as we possibly can. Now I should say something fundamental at this stage. Somebody once phoned me up and said, I want to write a very political play about a block of flats in Liverpool, a really hard-hitting political play. And I said, well, if you go in with that attitude, you won't write anything that's interesting in any way at all, because you've actually already predetermined the boundaries of what you're going to write. The great important thing with going into a new subject is to go in with an absolutely open mind and no set agenda. If you have a set agenda, you will find that you're diverting the material you find into your own preconceptual ideas, and that is fatal. You have to let the people you're interviewing set the agenda. After all, it's their life. And these are people whose voice is not normally heard. Another vastly important thing about my work is I give a voice to people whose voice is not normally heard. Normally, if you want to know about these things, you speak to an expert, you speak to a university professor, you speak to a politician, you speak to somebody who's a so-called expert. Whereas I think by and large, the people who live in the middle of a situation day after day after day probably know more about it than anybody. So why not listen to them? After all, it's their life and they have to deal with the circumstances in which they found themselves. So I think it's very important to listen to them and not to set some sort of agenda of your own in which you fit their evidence. The other way round. You let them set the boundaries of what you want to talk about. And of course, you then don't end up with agitprop. What you end up is with a human story. And I said to the girl in Liverpool, don't write a political play. Go and talk to these people, find out about their lives, listen to them, listen to what they want to say, and when you put it together, you will in fact write a play which is far more political than the political play that you wanted to write, because actually you're talking to real people about their lives, which is what politics is. Politics means of the people. It comes from polis, the city in Greek. You know, politics is about the people who live in a place and work in a place, or don't work in a place in this instance, because they haven't got any work. But you're trying to find out about their lives, and also what it avoids you doing is turning these people into stereotypes by picking and choosing, saying that suits my agenda. No, 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 no. Write them how they are. And of course, one of the things that happens then is that they are much funnier than they would have been otherwise. And if the play is relentlessly gloomy from beginning to end, people will switch off very quickly, because they don't recognize these people as being human beings that, the sort that they know and have, you know, everyday meetings with. They unless it has the color and idiosyncrasy of all of us, they're not going to recognize these people, and therefore they won't be interested. Now, my own personal preference, and I know you want to ask about this, about using a notepad and a pencil to talk to people. I mean, not everyone would agree with me, but the way I got into verbatim theatre, as you may know, was as an actor doing a play called Waiting Room Germany at the Royal Court Theatre in 1995. And Klaus Pohl, the writer, said, oh yeah, like I am using the video, you know, I put the video in front of these people and the microphone, and after half an hour they begin to relax. I thought, half an hour, you've missed all the goodies by now. If they're sitting there like terrified rabbits in the headlights, what's the use of that? Whereas if you get a notepad and pencil out, I don't feel in the least bit threatened by that. To me, that doesn't represent anything that's going to stop me speaking freely or feeling inhibited in any way at all. It seems totally unthreatening, and therefore it establishes a relationship almost immediately of trust between the interviewer and the person who's being interviewed. And I just have always found that if you start fiddling around and putting plugs in and putting things here and putting things in front of people, it somehow inhibits them. Whereas if you're just sitting there having a cup of coffee and a slice of cake and chatting away, and I say, you don't mind if I make a few notes, they feel absolutely unthreatened by that, and are therefore willing not to speak in any way which is guarded or threatened. So that's my own personal preference. Now, there are occasions, if we're working as a group, say, in an upstairs room in a theatre, and somebody comes to speak, that somebody might already have set up a microphone on the table and have it there, and I can listen to those tapes later. But on the whole, I haven't found them very helpful. And what I would say is also that it is a fantastic first edit. And I know a lot of senior and very brilliant journalists use a notepad and a pencil rather than sound recordings. Because of course they're going, somebody is rabbiting away, rather like I am now, speaking 10 to the dozen, and you think, well, that's quite interesting, and that's sort of not very interesting at all. So you don't actually have to write that down. And then something comes along which you think is riveting and informative and, you know, right on the money. And I've done enough of these now to know when it's gold or when it's dross, like panning for gold. I know when it's gravel and mud and silt, and I can suddenly see these nuggets of gold, and they're very easy to recognize. And especially in terms of being entertaining, of making us wiser, and in terms of being theatrical, these are things that I know I can use instantaneously. So I can only use examples all the time, but I was in the Dehesha camp in Beit Jala, not far from Bethlehem, And this man says, you should meet my sister, because her son is a martyr. He was called Jad, and there was an Israeli gunship. He was on top of a car. A rocket came down, and he was killed. And so I go and I don't know if you know the premise of the Arab-Israeli cookbook, but to stop it being political with a big P and to be humanitarian and political with a small p, I asked everybody I met to cook me a meal and to explain the recipe. So I walk into Fatia's house, and she's going to cook me perch with parsley and garlic. So we're talking about how much parsley, how much garlic and all that. And I notice there are pictures of Jad everywhere with candles under them and plastic daffodils. And so eventually, you know, having gone through the domestic, because she now knows we're talking on a domestic level, I said, would you mind very much if we talk about that last day? And one of my favorite questions, what was the weather like? She said, that day was warm. The days before had been cold, but that day was warm, because I remember when he came in for lunch, his face was glowing. He was slightly sweating. His face was glowing. It was slightly red, because it was a warm day. Of course, that is, to me, immediately, I'm thinking this is so brilliant, because we all understand that. We're on a level now in which a theatre audience will be relating to this woman and her son. And I said, and what did he have for lunch? She said, a small portion of zucchini with yogurt. He ate it very quickly. And then said, I've got to go out again. He was wearing a black polo neck sweater. He ate it very quickly. I said, before you go out, you must go and pray upstairs. He went and prayed. I said, because if God takes you, you must go with a clean soul and a clean conscience. I mean, the power of this form of writing is that however brilliant you are as a playwright, you can't get that level of truthful domestic detail, which is what attaches an audience to this sort of work. And then she said, oh, I'll show you the video. Amal, bring the video. So I think, the video, what's going to be the video? So suddenly, Amal brings the video, which is a compilation of tapes of Jad from a boy or from the time he became politically active. Suddenly the room is full. The next door neighbor, her brother, who is a policeman, comes in. Another couple of neighbors go, oh, we're going to see the video of Jad. We're all going round to Fatia's to see the video of Jad. So suddenly I'm sitting in this room on a cushion without my shoes on, you know, obviously. And there's this video. And one little part of me is going, how on earth did you end up here? You know, you live in northwest London, you read The Guardian, you know, you've got a nice house and a garden, and here you are, sitting with all these people, about to watch a boy being blitzed to death by something from a gunship. But of course, that's quite soon overridden by, this would make the most fantastic scene in a theatre. These people coming in now and watching this, and we don't have to see what's on there, but the fact that every time he appears on the screen they go, hi Jad, hey Jad, hey Jad, oh doesn't he look young, doesn't he look handsome there, oh look he's throwing a rock, oh look, great, oh no, you must watch this, and you're sitting, of course writing furiously, but also absolutely enthralled, but realizing that this is gold, this is theatrical gold. You can't, it's tragic, it's funny, it is completely human. You haven't put your stamp on this. These people are speaking for themselves. It has all the tenderness of a scene from a Chekhov play. And you realize that this is supremely important, that this event is recorded. And then they said after he was killed, they said, and this is the funeral, and they showed this footage of the funeral. And the man is saying, now watch, behind, look. They told, the Israeli authorities said this boy could not be buried. It would be absolutely against the spirit of any sort of cooperation if the boy was buried. But all the local dignitaries turned up. So they couldn't open fire on a priest and the mayor, and you know, these are important people leading the funeral procession. But 50 yards behind the funeral processions came the Israeli bulldozers and tanks ripping up the street, smashing the water supplies, the gas supplies, the electric supplies. So you have this extraordinary line of people with Jad, and then in the background you have these vast machines coming up the road, destroying the road surface and ripping down the telegraph poles. It's an extraordinary scene. And of course you can put this into a theatre. And that is when it's really, really good. Whereas a man called Kalev Bender from the Israeli embassy in Kensington came to speak to us. And I said, well, you know, well, how? And he just spoke from the book. He just actually spoke the handbook. He just reiterated the handbook about the rules, you know, and what he could say. And of course, I actually, although I was writing, I wasn't actually writing. I was just thinking, this is... I mean, had I wanted a character to just say what the book says, I could have put it in. But actually, you can go and read the book anyway, or you can probably read it in The Guardian, or you can, you know what I mean? There's nothing informative there. There's nobody speaking from the heart. This question of humour and grimness is paramount to political theatre. Because if it becomes worthy and bitter and over-savage, it's going to be counterproductive. And that's one piece of advice I always give to writers who ask me about. I said, well, you have to have a lot of humour, and you actually have to be very sparing with the grim detail, because if you have too much of it, it has an aesthetic effect. People sort of get pile-driven with misery into the floor. So you have to be very, very careful when you're writing this stuff that it's not too grim. And some stories, which I know would pulverize an audience, I have not put in my plays because I think they're too shocking, and they come to the stage then of emotional blackmail. You don't leave the audience a choice anymore because it's so horrible they have to be revolted by it, and I don't think that is a good way. That seems like a sort of pornography to me. That your violence is so severe that the audience don't have the option of not being shocked by it. Whereas some stories which are sort of not quite so graphic seem to me to be much more powerful. Because you're on the verge of something and you still leave the audience a choice of to what degree, whether they're going to be angry, whether they're going to be sad, whether they're going to be sickened, whether they're going to be very upset, but they're not forced into one particular emotion of being completely revolted by what they're listening to. So I think that's very important. And also the fact that we know that humour is one of the key human elements, and that, you know, these skeletons in the Second World War in Belsen, these you know, Jewish figures who had been starved and beaten and tortured, would stand next to the electric fence and go, "Did you hear the one about the tailor and his wife?" And what, you know, they would tell a joke. Even at the point of death, when and I did a play, acted in a play called Someone Who'll Watch Over Me by Frank McGuinness, and about those men shackled to the wall in Beirut, and the way they kept themselves sane was to tell jokes and make little plays and tell stories and entertain each other. That was what kept them going over those years and years and years of being shackled against the wall when they could have been shot at any moment. And it's very important that this stuff is not too grim and not too worthy. And it makes it, after all, you're trying to tell a human story. So you have to reflect humanity in all its aspects. And it also means that these plays are to a certain extent redemptive in the fact that you want people to come through something and have some sort of hope for humanity at the end of them. However grim it may be. And there's a wonderful bit at the end of State Affair when Andrea Dunbar's own daughter is talking. And she says, you know, some people are getting their lives together with courage and determination, and other people are going down a deep, dark slope into a big black hole, which is sobering and grim, but it's tempered by some people are getting their lives together with courage and determination. and you know, I think that is a pattern, if you like, which is, sorry to be erudite, which is more Sophoclean than Euripidean, because Sophocles, however ghastly Oedipus is, has at the end of his play some idea that we've learnt something from this and that we might be redeemed, whereas Euripides does sort of plunge us into a ghastly hellish world where all is lost and man is prey to his foibles and there's no hope. So, well, that's a choice a playwright can make.
So, I bet every time you did the research, you have a lot of materials. You have.
I use about 8% of what I gather.
Then, what is your principle of selecting that 8%? As you say, the human side,
well, in its widest form, entertainment.
Mm.
You're not going to choose the boring bits.
Yes.
You're not going to choose the repetitive bits. What you're trying to do, and at the same time, I have to say, as in no way exploiting the people you've interviewed. You must honour, if they've been good enough and kind enough to give you the story of their lives, then you have to treat that as something very precious. You're not there to pass judgment on them and to just select the bits that make them look like an idiot, or the bits that make them look like a buffoon, or the bits that make them look very, very serious and humorless. You're there to reflect that person in as accurate a way as possible. But of course you're going to use the bits which in the broadest terms are going to entertain your audience and to create a narrative.
So how to create a narrative?
Well,
it's always difficult, you know.
There are many narratives. There's a historical narrative. So, for instance, in Talking to Terrorists, it all starts when they're very young, it all ends when they're very old. But at the same time, you're trying to get strands which will fit in one with another in order to create that narrative, so that if you have three people sitting on stage, one of them said, well, I was politicised when I was 8 because we're trying to watch the television and bullets came through the window. And another man will say, oh, when I was 8, they tried to shoot my dog. And another one will say, when I was 8, this soldier came around the corner and bayoneted my mother. So that immediately has formed a sort of, and then they say, when I was 12, I started to carry one. When I was 14, I put my first bomb, and when I was 6. So already, and then having got to that stage, you might introduce a character who says, yes, because I remember seeing this from the other side. I was in charge of the British Army in somewhere, and I remember this event happening, and I remember. So you see how there's a story building. You're using your material to make, because if an audience don't care what comes next, you might as well give up. Mm. You have to intrigue, fascinate, lead your audience into wanting to know more about this subject. And so a narrative is really important, and it's an emotional narrative, it is a psychological narrative, it's a political narrative. All these things can be built in together to keep, as it were, a stream flowing through the evening, and that is something which verbatim theatre is in danger of missing sometimes. Otherwise it can become very monolithic, sort of just chunks of verbiage without much direction. And what you're interested in is a progression through these people's lives to some sort of resolution. And therefore the material you're likely to choose is the material which is both entertaining, through being either tragic or funny, and which generates a narrative within the piece and keeps the piece flowing and keeps the audience interested. And on top of that, something which is new. You can watch Newsnight, which is a sort of late night serious political chat show on the television, or you can read The Guardian or one of the responsible, broadsheet newspapers for political opinion. But so what's the point of putting any of that in your play? Because people already know that. You're interested in the things that people don't know about somebody. So even if you're interviewing somebody who is well known, a politician who's been in office, what you're after is a private view of what they think about the world, not the one that they've stated publicly, because we already know what they've stated publicly. You can read it, you've heard it. So what's the point of reiterating that on the stage? No, you're after a different aspect, a human aspect, a more detailed aspect, which will open up our knowledge of ourselves. Because that is, after all, what theatre does. It's opening up our self-knowledge, isn't it? And exploring the complexities of human nature. And therefore, you choose the material that people say, God, I didn't, isn't that fascinating? I didn't know that. God, what all that was going on, I didn't know that, I didn't know that, I didn't know that. That's the response you want to get. Oh, I was really interested in that, I didn't know that. So I think that's an important ingredient, that the material you're going to choose is things that people don't know, that it's entertaining, that it creates a narrative, and is informative. And I also think that people underestimate. It's very interesting. I suppose if I've learnt one, it is to be very, very careful about using the word ordinary. I noticed Theresa May the other day when she's saying we're going to do a lot for the ordinary working man. I thought, who is the ordinary? I mean, obviously you're extraordinary, Mrs. May, because you're Prime Minister. But who is the ordinary person you're talking about? This dull, mono-visioned, rather dull, strange, pedestrian person. This is the ordinary. Because I've never met an ordinary person. When I've been interviewing people, I don't think I've ever met anybody ordinary. They all seem to me to be complex, interesting, idiosyncratic, strange, interesting, fallible, funny, brilliant, tragic. And in State Affair, there's this character called Paul who analysed, he was a heroin addict who had committed some pretty atrocious armed robberies and was, by his own admission, hadn't got long to live, probably 6 months after our interview. And but as a piece of analysis as to how he had ended up in a sort of like a medieval morality tale, I don't think I've ever heard anybody give such a brilliant critique of their life with such insight. It doesn't matter how many professorships they've got. He was brilliant at analysing his life and how it ended up, So that, you see, to me is really important, because that's how, I mean, he lived in 2 blankets and a pile of leaves in the corner of a disused garage. How many people in the world of politics or the media would bother to go into a garage and talk to somebody who lived in 2 dirty blankets? Well, nobody, of course, is the answer, except a playwright who goes in there thinking there's a story here which could enlighten us. That doesn't mean to say you ignore all the other people, but it just means you add more voices to the mix so that you have a more informed opinion at the end of it.
And I know you are still working on using this approach verbatim, or you sort of this approach to work on a new plays. So it's been more than 20 years since you started writing a verbatim play.
Yeah, just 17, yeah.
Yes, the question is, why are you still using this form? And is there any, the second question is there any change after working on it for 17 years?
Well, to answer your first question is, who, in the, standards in public life are very much lower than they used to be. There is so much duplicity and cover-up, and people don't resign on principle very often anymore. It is, politics has become a business, a profession, like being a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer. Unfortunately, more like lawyers than being dentists, because at least dentists and doctors do some good. Whereas lawyers just make enormous sums of money through niceties. But there is no, it seems to me, with the lack of principle in politics, there is no real opposition. Who is asking the awkward questions? Who's saying, why is this being covered up? Why is this perfectly innocent man suddenly found guilty and put in a prison? What's going on? What's happening? And I think the arts in general, not just the theatre, but I think good photography is a very powerful form of investigative human behavior. No one will ever forget that child in Vietnam with his back on fire running down. I mean, that is but not just writing, but music and painting and sculpture. The arts is a way of examining ourselves in a much more thorough way than people in public life do. So there are always issues which make me go, oh, I'd really like to write about that, because who knows that? Who is aware of this going on? Who is aware when we all seem to be having such a wonderful time and getting drunk and stoned and driving fast cars and having continental holidays and going off to Ibiza to get smashed? Who is aware that actually down the road there is a great miscarriage of justice, or that some people are having a very deprived time, or are marooned in a sort of hopeless a pool of misery? What is exactly going on? And should we be examining some of these facets of, and not just glossing them over? And who is raising them in Parliament? Well, nobody. Who's raising them in the press? Well, hardly anybody. And if you do start raising this, you're dismissed as the chattering classes or agitators or left-wing. That was very interesting, wasn't it, with Woodward and Bernstein in the Watergate, that Nixon and his people were so vitriolic about the Washington Post, who actually were telling the truth. But he said, these are the people who are so un-American, who are so disloyal, who really want to diss our country, who really, they're irresponsible and they're left-wing and they're agitational and they're a sort of ghastly filth at the bottom of our society, when in fact they were the ones who were telling the truth. So I think the arts have a huge part to play in examining stories in far more depth than people would like, because there are certain people with vested interests who don't want these questions to be asked, who don't want us to examine ourselves. Oh, all you really have to worry about is who's been kicked off X Factor this week, or who's going to be murdered in the next soap. That's all you should really be concerned about, because we're feeding you tons of this stuff. Vote for this, vote for that, vote for Strictly Come Dancing, vote for this, vote for that. This is where your mind should be. Don't ask why the mental health unit down the road has actually been closed through lack of funding, when actually somebody else up the road who's done nothing but juggle figures on a computer has been paid £18 million. Don't ask that question. It's much more convenient to us if you don't. But I think there's a lot of people who actually, I'm going to ask that question and I'm going to look into it and I'm going to find out what's going on. So that is, I think we have a responsibility as a sort of opposition in public life to ask questions, not, as I say, in a very dour or grim, but just to go in and be truly investigative and ask what's going on. It doesn't have to be humorless, it doesn't have to be grim, it doesn't have to be worthy, it just is asking those questions. And how is well, like any art form, I think my writing has evolved into something more of a hybrid between verbatim and what you might call traditional writing, but I don't like these distinctions. I think they're wrong. I think they're erroneous. I think so much of what we have perceived as being traditional playwriting is actually verbatim. If you take a play like National Health by Peter Nichols, he said, well, I just sat in my hospital bed and wrote down what everyone was saying around me. That's not called a verbatim play. It is a verbatim play. It's absolutely a verbatim play. And even Andrea Dunbar herself, when Max said to her, why did you finish the conversation there? She said, well, they went round the corner. I didn't hear what they said next. So you see this idea that we had this sort of traditional theatre and then we suddenly had verbatim theatre, I think is erroneous. I think verbatim was a huge part of theatre anyway. So I don't actually believe in a strict distinction between verbatim and non-verbatim theatre. Therefore, I don't see why I shouldn't use some verbatim in my plays and then hybridize it with something that I want to extend for dramatic effect. And I might do that and I might not. I might keep it strictly verbatim, I might not. But that's my choice. as an artist. You know, you don't say to Monet, oh, you've got to paint in the same impressionist style that you've been painting for the last 10 years. You've got to have some poplar trees. You've got to have, you know, little boats far out on the horizon. Why? It's my painting, I'll do what I like with it. And I think sometimes if it depends what you're trying to say. I don't mean in a dogmatic way, but as a dramatic effect, you might find that you want to extend it into a slightly more theatrical world than is strictly possible just through verbatim. And I think I should be allowed to do that. I don't do it all the time. I'll say if I do it, I won't say if I don't do it. I'll say it's a verbatim play, it's a verbatim play. If it isn't a verbatim play, I'll say this is a researched play. And sometimes, I suppose, in the way that in verbatim play, so much of it is juxtaposition anyway. That's what verbatim playwrights do. They put one set of evidence against another in order to create a dramatic effect. That's the way you do it, either to create tragedy or humour. It's the way you cut your material and put it together. That is the skill and the creative part of it. Because we know perfectly well, if this is a book full of interviews and you gave the same book to 5 different playwrights, they're not going to come out with the same play. If you're only choosing about 8%, you're going to get 5 completely different plays from the same interviews. So that is your individual skill as an artist to do that, because it comes through you. You can hear the same violin concerto 3 times in a week and they sound virtually different because you've got a different violinist. Same notes, same score, but they sound completely different because they've come through the artist, through the violinist. The same with this material. You give it to David Hare, David Edgar, me, Alecky Blythe, you're going to get 4 completely different plays because it comes through our psyches, through our hearts, through our emotions, through our minds. So that you, as that creative artist, might suddenly think, I would like so-and-so to meet so-and-so in this play. And they don't, and I want them to, because I think the juxtaposition of these things would be powerful and informative. So in that case, I suppose I veer back to more what you might call traditional theatre. But that's only because I think it can be said more eloquently and more powerfully by doing that. So that is something I think I'm free to do if I want to, and not if I don't want to, because I don't want to impose rules on myself that you have to do this or you have to do that when you're writing a particular subject. But I nevertheless would say that all my work is based on, somewhere along the line, about a story that I've heard which fascinates me. I think, oh God, I really like the play I'm writing at the moment, which is called Kelso Rising. It's about a murder in Notting Hill in 1959, when a young Antiguan carpenter was knifed to death by 5 young white men on the corner of a street. I'd largely forgotten this case now. But I set my play 5 years later, and it was quite clear, because there had been riots the year before in both Nottingham and Notting Hill, in fact, that nobody was going to be found responsible for this murder, that politically, from on high came the notion that there was to be nobody found. I'm sure people knew who had done it. I'm also sure there were clandestine talks between the leaders of the immigrant community and senior civil servants, and I'm fascinated by that. Just as we know now for fact that at the same time as Margaret Thatcher was saying, we have to have Gerry Adams's voice dubbed by an actor on the news because we can't give credence to these animals, that in fact there were covert talks going on between the IRA and Downing Street. We know that for a fact now. So there's always much more to these things than meet the eye, and that of course interests me enormously. And there were even divisions within the immigrant community itself as to whether these small churches that were being set up privately in people's rooms were progressive and useful, or whether they were an excuse to hide behind God and actually emasculated the political movement. So this, you see, and all from this murder, which intrigues me so much, and that nobody was ever found. And the policeman clearly knew who did it, but wasn't going to say. No weapon was ever found. And within 2 days, this policeman who used to wear a bowler hat said this wasn't a racist killing, it was attempted theft. And the one thing that everybody is agreed on, everybody, the witnesses, people, there were about 8 witnesses to this, heard Kelso shout, "My wallet's empty, I have no money." And then 2 days later, this policeman says this wasn't a racist killing, it was attempted theft. And you go, it's quite clear that orders had come from somewhere that this case was. Now, beyond that, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the marvelous thing about plays is, as with Antigone, that both Creon and Antigone are right. And actually, in this case, both the pragmatists who wanted to stop civil war, civil unrest on our streets, and further murders and further unrest, had a very strong case. The people who wanted some sort of resolution to this for their own dignity and their, you know, their trust in people, they have a case. So you have 2 rights clashing, which makes us think, and that's when theatre is very powerful. So, but all my stuff is based when I hear a story that fascinates me, and it's always a true story. It's always something that I think, oh, I want to know more about that, and I think you might want to know more about that too, because the very elements of the hush-hush quietening of Kelsos and of xenophobia and of immigrants and are all absolutely relevant during this Brexit time in our country, and all the issues that were relevant then are absolutely relevant now. So you pertain, you know, historical parallels within your work, hopefully that people will say, oh yes, I see now, yes, it's been going on for a long time. Not something.
Even though it's a historical event, you are still looking for something relevant today.
Absolutely, and a really good story.
Yes.
And a really good narrative. Yes. I mean, how long have we got left? How long have we got left? Do you have to stop in a minute?
No, it's fine. I think 15 minutes we can start.
Okay. I was just going to say, just to talk about playwriting a little bit. Now, I couldn't possibly write if I didn't know where I'm going. I mean, say I'm going from here to Edinburgh, all right? You know, Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. So I think I've got this play, I've got an idea, and I'm starting here, and I'm going to end there. So Shakespeare says, I'm going to start on the battlements, and somebody's seen something, and I end up with a pile of bodies on the floor in the dining room. I'm going from there to there. I know that. Now, I can either go straight up the M1 and the A1 at 90 miles an hour in the fast lane, just go, get there. Well, you've got a revenge tragedy. You've got a narrative, but it's pretty thunderous and it's pretty relentless, and you've got from there to there. Now, I could set off from London and then think, oh, that's a nice wood over there, oh, that's quite a nice river, oh, there's a nice church over there, and after 3 years, you've got a quarter of the way there, because you've gone down every highway and byway. And so it seems to me the skill is to get from London to Edinburgh, not necessarily knowing exactly which route you're going to take, because that might vary on the way as you respond to things your characters say. And we also want a bit of philosophical truth. We also want some humour. We also need to stop for lunch. We need to have a cup of coffee from now and then. You know, we've got these various ways. So in Hamlet, for instance, there are these soliloquies where we learn something about the human condition, quite a lot about the human condition, in fact. So it seems to me that Shakespeare got it about right. You've got this thundering narrative, revenge, tragedy, but he does take time to go down side roads and byways and to look at human nature, human politics, psychology. All these things are facets of Hamlet. And to indulge ourselves in those for a bit while still being carried on this inexorable northward route. So it seems to me the skill of a playwright is to is to absolutely get from A to B, but for us to learn something quite interesting on the way, not just to judder along at 90 miles an hour, but actually to take time to discover something about ourselves on the way. And when I find a subject like this, I want to, yes, tell the story, but I think there's lots of relevance to our own lives now that this story can tell us about if we examine it in some depth. And if we suddenly get to I think, oh, I might take the mountain route and go over there to get back before just driving straight up the motorway. I might take a detour around there. I'm still heading north. I'm still on my route, on my narrative, but actually I'm taking time to discover something else on the way, and I think that's important.
It's more like referring to what you said just now, verbatim, like what you said. When you work on a play, you think, okay, I will call it verbatim if I'm like having certain qualities of it. It is not. It's heavily researched. I wouldn't call it like a verbatim play. But what my question is, probably like, I think 10 years ago, apart from you, there are a lot of playwrights who working heavily on verbatim theatre and
still are, in fact.
And trying to distinguish it from other kind of plays, like traditional plays. And I'm just wondering why. Like why we want the audience to know that it is verbatim, and does it give a certain power for the audience?
Well, I think you should say that it's verbatim because the audience will come up with a certain expectation to a verbatim. They will trust that everything they hear has been said by somebody. And they will expect it to be. They will expect it to be therefore serious. I'm not saying worthy, but it is serious and a serious examination of a facet of human nature, because it's verbatim, and it will be. They have to trust you that you're telling the truth, that these things have been said, and that you haven't manipulated them in such a way as to distort the truth of what you found. That is, I think what you know, if you see a photograph of Stalin and his inner circle, you don't expect to find that 4 people have been airbrushed out, which of course what Stalin does. He manipulates that photograph. So actually what you're being given is a lie. So I think with a verbatim theatre, people expect that you're not being mendacious, that you're not fooling them, that there is something absolutely truthful, basic truth about what you're telling them. But funnily enough, of course, they also expect it to be entertaining. So all these playwrights have juxtaposed, have chosen the interesting bits. You know, Alecky Blythe, she does all this stuff with things in your ear and all that. She's not going to choose the dull bits. She's going to choose the bits which are funny, interesting, tragic, and which tell a story, just like me. I mean, that's what she wants to do. She doesn't want to bore an audience. She wants to intrigue an audience, absolutely, and by putting all the ums and ers and little inflections, and I do that in a slightly different way. But I mean, we're getting into you know, very detailed waters here. But in Talking Terrace, for instance, there was my army captain, who's a very, very brilliant man, had a stammer, quite a noticeable stammer. Now, if I had put every stammer that he put in his speeches in my play, we'd still be in Act 1 now, 10 years later. Because you know, if you observe the way that he's actually speaking, you know, you've got pages of little. And that's going to clog your play up. But this man has a stammer, and his stammer is particularly noticeable if he starts talking A, about violence, or B, about women. So what I did was, to be honoured to him, to keep the play flowing, was only put the stammer in when he was talking about women. So when he talks about fetuses being cut out in Africa as a symbol of good luck, and you have to eat a child, you know, you have to eat a fetus to make you bulletproof. When he gets to that point, he goes, well, and you know, most of all with women, they used to cut the, because that seems to me both to be honouring him, but honouring the audience by not having page after page of stammers. Aleki would do something similar. She would edit out some of the stammers because they're still, again, you've got to be practical. You have to be pragmatic. You can't just, if you put every and and pause. Oh, there was another woman who said one word about every 15 seconds when I spoke to her. Well, Robin, the problem was, now if you went on, and Pat McGee, the man who put the bomb in the Brighton Hotel, spoke very quietly. What I did was I would go and sleep in a broom cupboard, and I'm sort of leaning forward to try and hear what he said. You couldn't, if you repeated that on the stage, nobody, even the other actors on stage, wouldn't hear a word he said. So there is a degree in all of this where we are complicit in adapting it for theatrical.
Yeah, but my question is, because verbatim or documentary theatre have placed heavily on the side they are true. They are the
yes.
And then.
But you see,
even there's lots of editing in it.
But it can't be the entire truth because of editing, because of, I mean, the way that Fai is sitting there, if I want to take his photograph, I have to decide, it is a photograph of him, it is the truth, that is a photograph of Fai. But if the light's coming from that way, or the light's coming from that way, or the light is head on, he's going to look completely different. It's still the truth, that's him. Rembrandt does a portrait of an old woman, but the fact that the light is coming from a little source up there and just catches one side of her face, when it's the truth, it is that woman, he's painted her portrait brilliantly, but it's not the truth, is it? Because he's chosen something which makes that face look how it looks. So yes, we are getting somewhere towards truth, but you can't talk about the truth because the truth is more complex than that.
Yeah, that's what
You're attempting to tell the truth. Now, of course, what verbatim theatre does brilliantly is not just look at one Rembrandt portrait or one photograph of Fai. It gives you that one and 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 that voice and that voice and that voice and that voice, often with completely different, like the Laramie Project, with completely different views of the world. And you're hoping that in the mishmash, the collision of these voices, somehow you are more informed and more able to reach a responsible verdict and somehow get nearer the truth about ourselves. But you're not going to do it just through one voice, are you?
Yes, definitely.
You're going to do it through a collision of truthful, what you hope are truthful voices, or people speaking as they see the world, and then you as the audience are left to make the decision.
Yeah, exactly. And why I ask this question is because in Hong Kong there are like artists who are trying to, because they use it as a kind of a strategy that, okay, I'm taking from real story, like real people's voices, and legitimate what they said is true, but without giving enough aspect, like voices that, like what you said, like from different angles. And I found it like problematic because,
well, you have to look at any play, write as well for the people whose opinion you disespouse as the people who basically you reflect your own values. You have to write as well for the people who are talking a different political language. You can't shortchange them. And that's what verbatim theatre does brilliantly, of course, is that you give equal value to all the people that you interview, even if they hold an opinion which is completely different to your own. And that's really important. And I do that in all my plays. So in Mixed Up North, for instance, in the little debate they have at the dress rehearsal, the rather right-wing councillor, who disapproves of who is racist and probably homophobic, you know, you write as well for him and as eloquently for him as you do for the liberal people whose opinion you probably personally are nearer to. You don't in any way denigrate his voice or you know, make his arguments look stupid while promoting the arguments of the other people. No, not at all. There's no, so in a way, that is a really good justification for verbatim theatre, that you're allowed to hear truthful, in a so-called, you know, old-fashioned play, you might well make the right-wing character look rather stupid, because that's what you want to do. But verbatim theatre can't do that. You give a truthful representation of him, as near as you possibly can, as well as the other side, and as well as him, her, them, it, whatever. You're hoping that where those different strands cross, the audience gains knowledge and entertainment.
Yes.
You see, so I suppose also with the proliferation of soap on the television, you get a very saccharine and misleading view of human life. It purports, a lot of soap purports to be very truthful, to be like, but I mean, how can it be? A, there's a censorship of language on television for anything before 9 o'clock and even after 9 o'clock sometimes. So how can you have a play called, a series called EastEnders on which nobody swears, when if you go to the East End, every third word you hear begins with an F or a C. So, you know, that's ludicrous for a start. And somehow they're very cozy and trite and platitudinous, these lives and what they say. So I think what verbatim, one of its great strengths is to say, actually, no, life isn't like soap. It's actually not as comfortable or packaged as that. And even reality TV, so-called, which is meant to be, you know, about getting into the nitty-gritty of people's lives, is totally unrepresentative of the sort of people I talk to. I mean, these people are so conscious of the fact that they are earning lots of money and, you know, saying things for the sake of saying things, that again, you get a completely distorted view of human nature. There's a desire, isn't there? There's a desire to try and find honesty, and through honesty, wisdom. There is a thirst for wisdom amongst a lot of people, especially theatre-going people. As I say, to understand who we are, where we're going, in that sort of Hegelian upward spiral of self-knowledge, that we don't always start at zero, that actually we use the past and experiences of the past. So next time we come to this sort of we're not starting down there, we're actually starting here, and we're trying to extend our knowledge. And I think that that's one of the great cri de coeurs of verbatim theatre, that we want the sort of knowledge which is useful for that process. Well, I don't think soap is useful in promoting that. I think soap is reductive. I think soap reduces everything always to cliché. But the whole point about verbatim theatre is it's not cliched, and you recognise that the minute somebody starts talking. And when I started writing, I got to write page 14 of State Affair, and I read it, and I was horrified. And I just went, this is complete rubbish, in the bin. Then I started a version where I selected all the bits that sounded like T.S. Eliot. And that was even worse, in the bin. And then, two things. When I was researching, there was a man in a bail hostel, the sub-warden of the bail hostel in Leeds, who thought I was some poshy southerner coming up to make money and profit out of people's angst in the north. And he said to me, never forget it's someone's life. And then I remembered this woman on the Buttershaw estate saying, we'd heard about it, of course. There was one before Christmas, there was one last October. But suddenly it's you. suddenly it's your child, suddenly it's your life. And I thought, you see, that is the way in, and has remained my way in always, is that this stuff is deeply, deeply personal. And the sort of details that come out when people are in that deeply personal state are the sort of things that make this such a rich art form. That they are talking unguardedly, they're talking through experience, and they're talking on an absolutely personal level without any other ulterior motive, and that's when it's brilliant. And that's what verbatim theatre can do so wonderfully well.